This is a video showing my methods for making a hammered copper ring with a matte finish. I'm measuring out the length of the ring blank for the size of ring that I want to make. In this case it's a size 9. It's going to be a 6mm wide band. I buy my copper in 14 gauge 11-foot rolls that are 9mm wide because I tend to make a lot of 9mm wide rings. This roll of copper serves both purposes. Here I'm marking out a 6mm wide width, which I can cut down with my jeweler saw. And here I cut the length first. It's important with copper to lubricate your saw blade with beeswax or burlap or whatever lubricant you choose to use. Copper can be really sticky feeling on the saw blade, and it will tend to heat up and kind of feel gummy. So it's important to keep lubricating the blade and always pull it down along with the angle of the teeth. If you pull it up along the saw blade, it will get the wax will fill the gap between the teeth, and the saw blade won't cut very well. And here I'm rounding the copper up with a soft mallet. It's kind of important with silver to really round the ends over too, because silver isn't as forgiving or as malleable as the copper is, but I still choose to round over my copper ends so that I can form the blank into well, as close to a round as I can get, as close to the final shape as I can get. It puts less stress on the join, on the solder join, in the end when you go to round the ring up and hammer forge it. It seems to prevent porosity and gives you a cleaner joint, especially using silver solder on copper. You really want to minimize how much of that you see. So if you make the D shape with the ring and then you go to round it up after soldering it, it kind of stretches the seam. And here I'm using V-groove pliers to help round the ring up into a rough shape, bringing the ends together. I wrap my V-groove pliers with tape to prevent marring the surface of the metal. And now once I bring the ends together, I run my saw blade through the join, and that helps flush both sides of the blank out at the join, so that I don't have to try to file the ends flat and get them perfect. I'm not very good at filing the ends. I found that just running the saw blade through it once or twice makes a perfect join. It cuts both sides at once. And here I am soldering. I make my own extra hard solder using brass and silver, sterling silver. But you can use fine silver. It's just you would use more brass to the fine silver. But you know, regular 75% hard solder works fine. I just like the little extra protection when I'm hammer forging metal and stretching it so much. I like the extra protection for the join. You know, I don't want it to split on me. And to be honest, I haven't really had many joint failures with the 75% hard solder. Putting pretty good amount of flux on the join because copper is really dirty when you torch it. So, you know, a little extra flux can't hurt. In this instance, I'm using Handy Flux. It's a paste flux. Works pretty well for copper. I've had the same jar that I've been using for about, I don't know, 3 years, and I still have over half of the jar left. This is an easy torch. It's also called a Orca torch. It's a propane air torch. It works pretty well for most projects that you would need to solder. It works well on gold, works well on sterling, fine silver, argentium, copper. I haven't really found a situation where it's not adequate. So I put a solder pallion on the block and set the ring join on top of the solder pallion, and then I just heat the join directly at an angle from above, and that will wick the solder up the join when it flows. The reason I don't heat the whole ring like some people say to do is I want the spring tension on the back part of the ring pushing the join together. And I found that doing it this way gives me a tighter join instead of annealing the back end of the ring before the solder flows. Now it goes into the pickle. I use alum for my pickle. And now I'm getting ready to clean the join up with a blue medium grit high flex wheel using my flex shaft. You just want to clean it up until you can't see a solder join or line, or at least barely see it. And if you have a problem with this, there are various ways of hiding it, but usually I don't worry about it. Running your saw blade down the join before soldering really gets the ends flush, so that the silver seam doesn't really show all that much. And I'm just going around the band there and cleaning off the rest of the band, shining it up a little bit. Your hammer pattern and the finish of your hammered pattern is only as good as the surface that you start with. So if you're doing a really polished ring, then you want to make sure that you start with a polished surface on your band before you start hammering, and also make sure your hammer's really polished as well. And I ran some sandpaper around the inner band to clean it up before hammering. That way I don't push any dirt or any particulate into the band as I hammer. I start off to the side of the seam so that the seam isn't work hardened before the rest of the band is hammered. It helps prevent your seam from failing, or your join from failing. And I make the band one size smaller than the intended size. That way I can hammer up a whole size during the forging process. So this was a 9. I started with about an 8 1/4 because a wide band should be sized to the center. So I take this ring up to almost a 9 1/2 on the ring mandrel to the edge of the band. And that kind of helps compensate for the wide band fitting issues that some people seem to have. And when you're forging a ring up on a sizing mandrel, the edges of the band kind of flare out and the middle bows in. So even though the edge says it's 9.5, the middle of the band will be closer to 9.25, somewhere between there, on a 6mm wide band. And now I'm taking a file and I'm going to flush the edges of the band. I'm not really big on rough formed copper. Some people are, but I like to flush the edges and put a high polish on them, unless it's a matte ring. In this case it's a matte ring, so I'm using a medium grit polishing wheel to work on this ring. It's gonna go in a tumbler anyways. Just keep turning the ring a little bit as you file. Now you got those burrs on the edges, on the outer part of the ring and on the inner band, and we're going to have to take care of those next. I'm just using you can use a round or half round file and go around the inner part of the band and kind of knock that burr down, put a little bevel on the inside. That's forming the chamfer that we will refine and smooth with a polishing wheel. Once again, I'm cleaning up the inner band, any forging marks that might be left from the ring mandrel. Using a 500 grit sandpaper for that. If you want, you can go back and use a fine grit sandpaper to make the edges more polished or refined. And here I'm taking that medium grit blue high flex wheel and refining the inner chamfer that we cut in with the file. Do that on both sides. And from there we're going to use the wheel to polish the outer part of the band, or the sides of the band, I mean. Make sure there's no filing or sanding marks. And once we do that to both sides, we can go in and take care of the burr on the outer part of the band toward the sides. That's a really nasty burr that was there from filing. Your rings should really, all the edges should be chamfered or smoothed over, buffed. You don't want any sharp edges for your customers to get cut on or feel any discomfort. And that's it. Now this is a matte ring, and that's going in a tumbler, just a rock tumbler with I use aquarium gravel. You can use anything from pea gravel to some really coarse sands, but I find the sands leave a more of a shinier finish than I prefer. So any type of aquarium gravel seems to work well. it is tumbling, and here's the final result.